My name is Bill Dedman, and I work now for Newsday, the newspaper on Long Island in New York. I've been at NBC News 8 years before that, mostly online, nbcnews.com. And back in the 80s, I was at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and the stories we're talking about today were called The Color of Money, stories about redlining or racial discrimination in mortgage lending, discrimination in making home loans by banks and savings and loans. And I worked for Bill Kovich, who was the editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and for his deputy, Sonny Rawls, or Wendell Rawls, Jr. They're both Tennesseans, by the way. I'm from East Tennessee, from Chattanooga. And Ralph McGill, of course, was from East Tennessee, from Saudi, and I went to college partly on a Ralph McGill scholarship that it was one of the few journalism scholarships available I'd applied for. And had met Sonny Rawls at the Chattanooga Times when he came up to do a seminar for the newsroom. And I really liked his aggressive approach. And when he got the job in Atlanta, as Kovich's number 2, when they took over there, I wrote to Rawls and sent him my clips and my meager resume. And he called a few weeks later and he said, I have a job for you and I want to tell you how that interview went. This was the job discussion, the job offer. He said, yeah, I have something for you. I said, that's great. I said, what would I be doing? And he said, oh, you'd be covering City Hall or something in sports. And that didn't sound too promising. So I said, well, how much does it pay? And he said, do you want the goddamn job or not? And I allowed as how, yes, I would like the job. And that was the end of our negotiating process there. I was very excited to work for Kovich and Rawls in Atlanta. And it was a time with new editors and a lot of new staff. I think like many new editors, they made the mistake of treating the folks who'd been there before as though they didn't know what they're doing, and only the new people that they'd brought in would know what they're doing. But I was one of those new people, so I was benefiting from that a great deal. The biggest story in the first year I was there was the prison riot, where the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary was taken over by prisoners for 11 days. And my wife and I, now married 24 years, Pam Belloc was a reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution when I was, and we met at the prison riot. So when people ask where we met, we just say at prison and leave it at that. Sometime after that, I was assigned to do one of those bad ideas that you really hate because your editor thought of sort of the generic idea. The Democratic National Convention was coming to Atlanta. And all these stories were about the booming South and how well Atlanta was doing for a special section. And I guess they thought, well, we should at least mention that there are some poor folks in Atlanta. That was the idea. So they had 2 stories, one about Grady Hospital and one about low-income housing. And I was assigned to go do a story about people who were trying to provide housing. I was standing with a Methodist minister out in an area called South Atlanta. That's a neighborhood, South Atlanta, where a Methodist minister was developing with an organization some houses for people to buy. And he said, the problem we have here is that people can afford these houses, but they can't get loans for them. That is, their monthly payment for the homes would be lower than what they're paying now for rent. Been steadily paying rent all these years. But the banks and savings and loans that make home loans in Atlanta don't make home loans in this neighborhood. And I said to him, well, gee, Craig, his name was Craig Taylor. I said, this doesn't seem like a particularly prosperous neighborhood to me, sort of lower middle income. And if I had any money, I'm not sure I'd lend it here either. And he said, well, I could see what you mean, but the banks in Atlanta don't lend money in the prosperous black neighborhoods either. They don't lend money in Cascade Heights where Hank Aaron lives. They don't lend money where Coretta Scott King lives. And I said, really, that can't be so. He said, yes, you can look it up. And so I went away writing my little BS story for the convention planning book, but thinking that that's a story that would be worth pursuing if we could nail that down. That's how The Color of Money got started. I went over to the business news section and talked to the banking reporter, and he said that he had proposed this story long ago and the editors wouldn't run it. I went up to the library, the morgue, where the old clips are, and no bodies, but old stories. And I found, I just now heard this word redlining. I didn't know that before. And I found a packet of stories from the 60s and early 70s, but nothing from the 80s about redlining. And one can construe one of two things at that point. Either redlining stopped, or it had continued, but we had stopped writing about it. And my guess was the latter. I'd grown up in the South. I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and I was well aware that there was racism in the schools and in the newspapers, and that it probably continued, that it hadn't been that long ago. I'll tell you a little story from Chattanooga. My first job, I was 19 on the copy desk, had been a copy boy at 16, and I'm at the Chattanooga Free Press at 19 editing copy. And these were in the old days, we're working on paper, no computers. And we had stamps, so, you know, I don't mean postage stamps, but the kind where you'd stamp a word on a piece of paper. And we would stamp in red ink or black ink, city edition or final edition on the copy that we had, were preparing. So that when we sent it to the composing room, they'd know what paper to put it in. And the fellow sitting next to me on the copy desk had gone down to the Chattanooga Stamp Company and had ordered a special stamp that he used and would stamp onto certain stories, local news stories, about crime in black neighborhoods in Chattanooga. He would stamp this on the copy which he sent up to the composing room. And that little stamp, he'd ordered it and then had gone to pay for it and pick it up, said, "Another nigger caught stealing." Well, that was... I graduated from high school in '78. This was 1980. And now here I was in 1987 in Atlanta. And Atlanta had a reputation as the city too busy to hate. What they meant by that in the 60s was, we're smart enough here and good businessmen running the community, and we're not going to let our bus system get shut down like in Birmingham. We're going to accommodate the civil rights movement. We're not going to let a fight over civil rights get in the way of progress. And there was an ethic, part of the story that Atlanta told about itself. I guess you could call that a myth, but I don't mean completely untrue. But part of Atlanta's story about itself was that there wasn't really an issue of civil rights for African Americans in Atlanta. And of course it had the models of Martin Luther King, the King Center, King's Father's Church, other leaders from the SCLC and others. But my personal experience suggested to me that racism was not in such a distant past. And I also had the experience of going to a prep school in Chattanooga and with basically a bunch of bankers' kids and a few middle-class kids like us. And it didn't seem to me so far-fetched that there might be some racist attitudes. Now we can talk in a minute about whether or not it was intentional or unintentional racism at play. Anyway, that's how we got started. Then the next step in the process was to look at what others had done. I was reading the clips from other places searching on Nexus, searching online around the country, and I kept finding not other newspapers who'd been reporting on redlining, but a few academic studies. There was a professor at Temple University in Philadelphia and one at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore who had gotten information from the Federal Reserve. It turned out that every bank and savings loan in the country, everybody who made a home loan, had to report where they made it by census tract. And this was so people could check for exactly this kind of information. Well, the trick was to take that information about where the banks made loans and to match it up with demographic information from the census. Who lived where? People of what income and what race lived where, and then to make maps. My son was 5, and Justin, and I remember him being on the floor of the art department of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, helping color in the final maps that we were going to use to make for the paper. And what we had was census tract maps, each little area, and I would color around the edge of each tract black or red, the colors we were using, and then he would fill them in. He's down there coloring in, filling them in, or 5. Nearly a year later, when the announcement of the Pulitzer came in, Justin was a little upset or confused at first because he had misheard. He thought that we had won the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes, which might have been better. And he had baseball cards. He was a big baseball fan and still is. And he was planning to buy the Atlanta Braves with our winnings. But instead we got enough for me to get some nice new shoes. That was the main purchase. I was struck by the reporter in the business section who said I tried to get them to do this story and they wouldn't let me go forward. But these were new editors, and I was expecting that the editors would let me write about whatever we found. They immediately said, let's pursue this. You know, put on it a good editor, helped, they spent money so I could go to a conference where all the bankers and others were meeting to get people talking about this. We ordered the data from the Federal Reserve. They brought a couple of professors from the University of Minnesota who were studying this data and trying to get it used. They came down as our consultants, and we worked out what the plan was, the study design of which communities we would be studying and what income levels we would look at. The core of the study design was to look at middle income neighborhoods, not those that were too rich, because there were the wealthiest white areas had no counterpart. And to look at, and we didn't want to look at poor areas because this wasn't a story about poor people. This was a story about people who could afford homes, but where were they getting their home loans? So we were looking at comparable middle income neighborhoods, and they helped us draw those lines. And the editors were fully supportive all the way up until the end. You know, I saw some proofs that came back as we were nearing publication. And there were not only the articles and photos, but charts ranking the banks, ranking the lenders on their market share, on their activity in black middle-income neighborhoods. And the stories came back on the proof. The charts came back deleted, X'd out. And I asked around, and I found out that one of the editors from the former regime, you know, still there, you had to have somebody who knew how to run the presses and get the paper out on time, had X'd those out. There was no explanation given, but it seemed clear to me that the idea was, it's one thing to talk about the banks, and it's another thing to name names. And that's really going to offend specific people. And Bill Kovach marked those charts back in. He edited them back into the story. Without consulting with me about it, without, you know, I think it's okay to keep the reporter in the dark about the darts and arrows that the editor at the top is taking. He's taking them and dealing with the flag. When the stories came out, I remember how angry the bankers were. I remember being on the phone with the spokesperson from Citizens and Southern Bank, how upset the community was. But it was the cartoons that really got them. Doug Marlette was drawing cartoons for the Constitution. And he had a cartoon that you can see with a middle income black couple standing by the receptionist. The sign says Atlanta Banks, and the receptionist says, "You'll need to speak with one of our loan officers." And in the background, you can see the loan department, and inside is a gentleman at the desk with a Ku Klux Klan outfit on and a hat. Once his cartoon came out, the anger of the bank shifted to Doug Marlette. He took some of the heat off on me. But I want to talk about that image of the banker as racist. We have no idea what was in the minds of the lenders. What we know is what their activities were. They weren't doing business in these areas. And we later found out by looking at a couple of the large institutions that their rejection rate for loans was much higher for African American applicants than it was for whites. So it wasn't just that they didn't get applications, they were rejecting those applications. But that doesn't mean that there was intentional racism behind it. What you have is a disparate effect. You have a behavior that leads to a different result, which is still illegal, but it may not be what people assumed it was, and it therefore may be harder to solve. We made maps of where banks had ATMs, where they had branches. They had closed branches in black neighborhoods in Atlanta, even though some of those branches had more deposits, more money on deposit than in some of the white branches that stayed open. We mapped where you could put in a mortgage loan application. You couldn't do it at every branch. In some neighborhoods, for some banks, you had to drive all the way to the white side of town to do that. The bankers, I think, had a perception that black meant poor. One of the great things that happened out of the series was that the Chamber of Commerce and Bank South got together and had a man, an African-American man who really knew the south side of Atlanta, the black side of Atlanta as it was then, take some bankers from Bank South on a tour on a bus. And they were foolish enough to let me go along with a photographer. And we were driving through these really nice lived-in neighborhoods and some being developed on the south side, African-American neighborhoods. Now at first we were driving by check cashing stores and liquor stores and rundown neighborhoods, and the bankers were elbowing each other and saying, "See, this is what I told you we were going to see." But then we got into some neighborhoods. I remember being out in front of a house that was not yet occupied, and the banker was looking through the window into the kitchen. Oh, and you could tell that was a much nicer kitchen than she had at home. These were going to be $2–3 million homes, which at that point was very much at the high end. And these bankers didn't know that these neighborhoods existed. They'd never been assigned as junior bankers to work in a branch that was in those neighborhoods because they didn't have any branches in those neighborhoods. And if you're operating your business where black means poor, you're going to get a segregated system. Later, after the stories came out, I was introduced to a company called Flyer Express. Think about how small an action can lead to something so large. This little company would deliver a little piece of paper from every lender, every bank, every savings and loan, every mortgage company. Once a week, they would deliver it to every realty company in town, every real estate agent. Now, of course, now you do this online, but then they had a little company with somebody driving around little bags full of pieces of paper and hanging them on the doorknobs of real estate companies every Thursday morning with their rates for that week. This is what our mortgage program is for this week, what the rates are. How did this Flyer Express company decide where to deliver? Did they deliver every bank's piece of paper to every real estate agent in Atlanta? No. Every 6 months, Flyer Express would send a little form. It looks like a pizza delivery order form to each of the banks. And it would say, where do you want your flyers delivered? And the options were north, south, and both. And if you checked north, then it was the same in Atlanta as if you had checked white. Realtors send customers to get a mortgage where they think the loan will be approved. because that's how then a home will be sold. If the loan is approved, then they get to sell the home and make money. So the banks were not showing attention in these areas. We're not getting as many applicants in these areas. We're not as familiar with these areas. Now, is that intentional racism? In a way, it doesn't matter. If a fellow's backing out of your garage with your bicycles in the middle of the night, you don't stop him and ask him if he's intending to steal your bicycles. What matters is that he's breaking the law. Intent doesn't really matter. But I think it is worth pointing out that the assumption that people had was, oh, it's racist behavior, it's intentionally racist behavior, and so they just need to stop doing that. Think about that perception that black means poor. In response to our stories, the banks in Atlanta put together a fund, at first $54 million, and the fund was its main purpose was to stop the protests that had begun. There were marches, there were efforts to take money out of the banks and move it to the black-owned banks in Atlanta, which had a 0 default rate on their home loans. Very careful, maybe even stingy lenders. So they were to stop the protests, but also help people get homes, and that program made loans to whom? Poor and low-income homebuyers. Now, we had written a story about the banks not lending money in middle and upper middle income black neighborhoods, and the fix was to come out with a program to lend money to poorer and lower middle income black neighborhoods. Now, that was a useful thing, but you see how the perception that black meant poor was so embedded that it was not only in the problem, it was just sort of ignored in the solution. And that was striking to me later. We didn't do much criticizing of the solution. I don't think anybody wins a Pulitzer Prize by writing about a problem and then somebody fixes the problem and then you attack the fix. I think the paper did an insufficient job of really analyzing whether this was fixing the problem. I think we were probably too busy patting ourselves on the back for it having gotten fixed. The best thing really that came out of the stories was the law was changed and we can now get more information. What we had was where the banks made loans. We didn't know anything about who applied for loans. We only had that for a couple of large savings and loans because they had a separate system. And we were able to look at those savings and loan rejection rates for the whole country. And we're able to point out, for example, that in the Midwest, in Milwaukee and Chicago, the disparity between how the banks treated black and white applicants for loans was much greater than it was in Atlanta. That was sort of good news, bad news for Atlanta bankers. It was still pretty wide. But we didn't have that information from the banks. And the result of the stories was that Congress changed the law. This Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which had produced this data we were working with, was amended. And I remember going up to see Joe Kennedy, who sponsored the bill, and the main effect was that Congress now made greater information available about applicants in different income groups and whether they were approved or rejected. Not your name when you apply is not a public record, but statistics about the applicants is now available, and we've seen a lot more stories throughout the country about redlining and other elements of racial discrimination in mortgage lending. You know, I'm thinking about the role of Bill Kovach in the stories, and one of the main lessons I learned from him was the idea of making the stories bulletproof and as fair as possible in tone. You know, you would think that a story that would shake things up would have a more of an accusatory tone, and as a youngster, I would certainly, were inflammatory in our youth. But we were so careful in our methodology that we weren't going to look at just any disparity. Of course, the blacks were, on average, generalizing, poorer than whites, had less wealth than whites. So you would expect that there would be some disparity in the lending, but that wouldn't be a meaningful disparity. And once you start to narrow it down to apples, I remember having this feeling as a 27-year-old, this feeling of, oh, the story's slipping away. We had a disparity of 1,000 to 1, and now it's 200 to 1, and it's 20 to 1. Oh my goodness, our whole story is collapsing. And in the end, we ended up with a disparity of 4 to 1 or 5 to 1. And you know what? A bulletproof 5 to 1, something that you really can defend, that's carefully drawn, is far more powerful than a slipshod 100 to 1. So I think that was a lesson for me. In the tone of the way the articles were written, the influence of Bill Kovach was to make them absolutely fair in tone. I mean, to the extent that we didn't call them bankers. I said, why can't we call them bankers? And Bill said, well, people don't like bankers. So we're going to call them banking executives. So that's what they are. In The Color of Money, they're banking executives. But it was part of an effort to make it as fair as possible. I also remember a key moment was that one of really the main anecdote in the first story was about Michael Lomax, who was the head of the county commission, the county government, elected leader, who was, I had heard a story, a planner at the county had told me, you should go talk to Michael Lomax. He had some kind of trouble getting a loan. And I talked to him, and he said, yes, I was trying to get a home improvement loan for my home, which is in a mostly African-American neighborhood. And he said that my banker told me, why would you want to put money into improving a home in that neighborhood? Why don't you just move out of that neighborhood and put your money into a better neighborhood? And Lomax was offended by this. We wanted to include that anecdote, but we were worried, the editors were worried. What if there's some other reason that he's not telling us of why his loan was not approved? What if he has bad credit? He wasn't going to tell me that. So we got to a point where Bill Kovach got on the phone without me being there. I knew he was in his office talking to Michael Lomax on the phone, grilling him about his credit, about money he had in the bank, information that he didn't share with me and wouldn't have shared with a reporter. But he was vetting our main anecdote just to make sure that we weren't out on a limb with Michael Lomax and his checking account and his credit rating. And then when Kovach was satisfied, he said, okay, we can run that. You know, Bill Kovach's tenure at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution didn't last long. By the time the Pulitzer was announced the next year in '89, I flew back from Washington. I was at the Washington Post. I'd left after Kovach quit or lost his job. He either fell or he was pushed, depending on who you believe. But clearly he and the publisher had fallen out, and there had been a series of disagreements. They seemed to have disagreed about who would be in charge of the Washington Bureau, whether the editor ran that or somebody from Cox, the newspaper ownership group, ran that. They seemed to disagree about the budget and budget cuts in the newsroom, as all editors and publishers do. And they had disagreed about the stories, like the banking stories and some tough stories on Coca-Cola that had been done in the business news section, and others. And Kovach was in there taking that heat from the publisher, from board members, from people who would, in the business community, who would call their favorite board member or a member of the Cox or Kennedy family. And it really, you know, we were completely insulated from that in the newsroom. I appreciated it, you know, only after the fact, or to realize how much pressure there was on the editor to deal with the letters that came in about our stories. And, you know, we've all worked for bad editors. I worked for an editor once who would just eat the food off of your desk. You know, like if you had M&Ms, he would shake some out and eat them while he's talking to you without saying, can I have some M&Ms? And I saw this editor take a bite out of the education reporter's hamburger once. We've all worked for bad editors. But one of the bad things that editors do is they pass all the heat down to you. They're not heat shields. if a letter comes in from a business person, then you find yourself in the publisher's office or the editor's office, and that business person's on the other side of the desk with the editor or the publisher, and it's 2 against 1, and you feel like you're in court without an attorney. But the good editors, the great editors, are heat shields, and they get those letters, and you know they may get ulcers. It may tie them up. Maybe they don't last long in that job. They burn up. But you don't even hear about those letters. Only after Bill Kovach had lost his job and we had held a New Orleans style second line funeral march through Atlanta, and many of us, at least many of those who had come in with the new crowd, we had dispersed to other places. Only afterwards do you start to hear the stories about how the editor had stuck up for you and you weren't even aware of it. That's one of my main memories of that time. You know, it's curious if you think about the history of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and you think of Ralph McGill, and you think of Gene Patterson, and both articles and editorials, Jack Nelson and others, through the years on the side of civil rights. It's odd to think of a time here in the 80s when maybe the paper was a little more skittish or reactionary on those issues, or protective of community pride. And at the time, I don't know, this is a pure speculation, at the time I sort of thought of it as, well, the Journal and the Constitution were always different creatures, and those men I've described, they came from the Constitution side. Maybe it was Journal folks who were in charge during that period, and now, and that we were dealing with, who were replaced by Kovach. There also was just some outsider-insider view. Bill Kovach was from Nashville, Tennessee, had been at the Tennessean, but then had gone to the New York Times and had been there a long time at the New York Times in Albany. He had worked on the Pentagon Papers stories for the New York Times. He was the fellow at the copying machine making the copy of the Pentagon Papers, and had worked on Watergate, and had been the Washington bureau chief, well respected for the New York Times. He hired as his number 2 Sonny Rawls, who had been the New York Times reporter in Atlanta. These are Southerners, but they're New York Times Southerners. And there may have just been some different attitudes toward racial matters, different attitudes toward defending Atlanta business interests. And there may have been, from the Atlanta point of view, some, as Louis Grizzard, the columnist, the humor columnist, redneck humor columnist would have put it, well, if you don't like Atlanta, Delta is ready when you are. You know, why don't you folks go back home? And they would say, well, we're from here, we are home. But I think there was some of that new group in town being resented, and maybe some inevitable clashes from that. But that's just speculation. But it did feel a little bit that even though we were Southerners working for Kovach, we were sort of the new outside group that was in charge. I'll mention the data part of this story. You know, the color of money is when people tell the histories of database journalism, it's one of the early examples, I guess the first Pulitzer-winning example, but it's not the first story where people used a computer to look at data or used a computer to analyze public records. But it's one of the first that was noticed around the country, partly through Kovach's efforts. One of the things he did was, he said, others are going to do this story and we want them to know we're doing it first. And so he made a reprint, the green book with the red line across the cover, and sent that to every newspaper in America and every member of Congress and a lot of other leaders. And that was to put a foot in the door and say that we did this first. A story about that competitiveness. I was out working on the story and met a reporter from the Detroit Free Press who was very clearly doing the exact same story that I was. He was looking at Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, and he was going to do a story about redlining in Detroit. And it was very clear to him and to me that we were going to get finished first. We had started first. We were well ahead of him. We were going to finish first. He was just out of luck. But Kovach and Rawls had that story in mind and knew that Detroit was going to come out with this and didn't want to have to share credit. Well, we did a later story about the study that they did in Detroit. The Detroit reporter made a mistake. We had gone around to meet with every banker in Atlanta who we were writing about and gave them their data. Here's the pattern of your loans. Can you explain it to us? And we had these fun but awkward meetings in boardrooms of 11 institutions where the PR person and the head of compliance and mortgage lending would all be there. And they would say, well, maybe the homes are not in such good condition in those neighborhoods. And they'd lean forward, and I would say, well, you know, we thought that might be true, so we checked. And did you know that if you go by the city and citations for not keeping your home up, did you know that there are more citations in white middle-class neighborhoods in Atlanta than there are in black neighborhoods? I didn't know that, but we found that that's true. And they would sit back in their chair. And each time they would have a possible rebuttal, we had already checked that out, and they would sit back again. Well, we showed each lender only its records. But the reporter at the Detroit Free Press had sent every lender in town everybody's records. And one of the bankers gave it to a reporter for the Detroit News. And the Detroit News wouldn't run it. But they gave it to us. And so on the day that that Democratic convention finally came to Atlanta, and everybody from around the country, all the journalists from around the country are in Atlanta hotels on the Sunday before the convention. On the front page of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, we had a story, two stories. One was about a national study that we had done, and it mentioned, right in the third or fourth paragraph, that another sort of confirming data point has come up. The Detroit Free Press has done a study, and these are the results of the Detroit Free Press study showing a similar pattern in Detroit. Well, two things about that. One, the editor of the Detroit Free Press was in Atlanta, so our newspaper showed up at the door of his hotel room that Sunday morning. And second, his paper hadn't published that study yet, but he was reading about it in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. There's a little bit of elbowing and competitiveness that I think that served us well there. That's one of my memories of Bill Kovach's activities this time. You know, the computing on this was really very simple. We just used a spreadsheet. We were making simple calculations. We were having to deal with these old 8-inch floppy disks, if nobody remembers those, from the Federal Reserve. And these were just plain text files of numbers with no indication where the columns went. And we didn't know how to import that into the old version. We weren't even to Excel yet. We weren't even to Quattro Pro, the old spreadsheet. And we didn't know how to import that, so we were actually doing it in a word processor. There was a weekend where we were supposed to have the data work done. I was there with these two professors from Minnesota, and it was a snowy weekend, and our editors and the assistant managing editor who was in charge of data, they were all out of town. And they were going to come back on Monday and find out what our study had found. And all weekend we ran a macro in Word that would go over certain spaces and put in a tab, and then it would go to a certain point and then put in a line return. And it was running. We had borrowed all the other computers in the newsroom. We had 11 computers from the accounting department that were all running these macros on this Federal Reserve data. Monday morning, the editors come in, and we haven't slept at all, and they say, what did you find, your study of lending in Atlanta? And we said, well, we have put spaces in the numbers. That's how far we got so far. Our understanding was primitive. Our equipment was primitive. There was only one PC in the building. But in terms of what people are doing today, you know, the computing part of it was the least of it. The story was remembered as an early example of database journalism. I think we got a little too excited about the computer part of it. And the key to it for me was the design of the study. The key to it was how we designed the study so it was defensible, so it was bulletproof. So we accounted for every possibility. And the reporting we did in the field, going to courthouses and gathering information about ATMs and deposits and bank locations, all of that about how the system worked was as important as just the pattern of the map. The map was what was most striking. But it's easy to get excited about this shiny new technique. And of course, journalists were last. You know, they already had computer-assisted history and every other subject in college long before we had computer-assisted journalism. But we were finally getting into the game.